Senators Susan Collins and Angus King have introduced legislation to honor former U.S. Senator George Mitchell. The bill would change the name of Acadia's Hulls Cove Visitor Center to the George J. Mitchell Jr. Visitor Center. Mitchell was born in Waterville and served as a member of the Senate from 1980 to 1995. He also served under President Bill Clinton as a special advisor to the peace process from 1995 to 2000. President Barack Obama is a special envoy to the Middle East from 2009 to 2011. President Jimmy Carter in 1979, where he served on the U.S. District Court of Maine.